So it's a way to establish a new benchmark for government resilience to corruption risks and for strengthening public integrity. The indicators are developed by and for governments, and this means that the indicators will help countries to measure the implementation of the OECD Public Integrity recommendations and provide an international perspective on integrity and anti-corruption policy. And what I think is most important is that it will also enable policy officers to start a discussion on integrity and anti-corruption within their own public administration, as well as with civil society. The indicators are based on primary data sources and validated by countries. Santiago presented the process just before, but I wanted to highlight two examples of this process which I think are very useful. So the first one is the task force, of which the Netherlands has been a member. And this is a small group of OECD countries willing to dive into the survey questions, critically look at what we're asking, pilot the data collection, and help shape the indicators. But even after the data collection, which the OECD is always really helpful in finding and helping to collect the data, the OECD countries have been actively involved in improving the process by discussing the data collection during, for example, OECD SPO meetings. And I think this shows the effort by the OECD, but also the OECD countries to get the best results possible to start this conversation on anti-corruption and integrity policy. So, of course, during the process of shaping the indicators and the data collection, we encountered several challenges. For example, with regards to defining the sub-indicators, questions, criteria that really measure the indicator, that also matches with the data available in the different countries, or maybe data that is already available by other international organizations. And Jesper, you already mentioned it, but what is particularly the case in the Netherlands is that we have a very decentralized organization of government, which can make the data collection for different sectors on different topics quite a comprehensive task to do. But once it's finished, the result is an in-depth international benchmark on the efforts by governments to tackle corruption and fostering integrity, which I think is something we should see as a goal and keep in mind. So briefly, to discuss the integrity system of the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, there is a strong integrity culture in the public administration. The legal and institutional framework to fight corruption is in place, and there are several initiatives underway to further strengthen the framework to prevent and tackle corruption. Within our civil service, the Civil Servants Law, for example, defines the integrity framework, and the Central Government Code of Conduct applies across the whole of central government and provides civil servants with a framework for ethical conduct and contains information, for example, on conflicts of interest. To create awareness, we also find it really important to maintain an open dialogue with our civil servants about integrities and dilemmas that may arise in this area. So really a preventive approach. And we see that the effort should not only be made to establish rules and agreements, but also to integrate them in our joint integrity culture and the mutual understanding of our ethical behavior. So looking at current data, it shows that the Netherlands, in the Netherlands, public perception of corruption has been consistently low over the years. The Netherlands ranks 8th in the most recent Transparency International Corruption Index, as well as the Eurobarometer on corruption, which ranked the Netherlands among the countries with the lowest level of corruption in the EU. However, these are both data sources on the perception of corruption. And I think the public integrity indicators bring a new dimension to the discussion on anti-corruption and integrity, as it visualizes what countries are actually doing to tackle corruption and foster integrity. So as it shows what countries are doing, it also shows what countries might not be doing. And this, I think, is also very helpful from the indicators, is that it shows countries where there maybe are possible policy gaps which require more action, or maybe to start a discussion about. So if we look, for example, at the indicator on the quality of anti-corruption integrity strategic framework, the Netherlands, we have a rather high level of consultation in practice. Extensive public consultation is carried out both at national level, regional level, local level for policy, as well as for legislative processes. However, the indicator also shows that although we monitor and report yearly on integrity, more attention can be given to the indicator coverage, which looks at the formulation of strategic objectives for mitigating risk in specific sectors. And I wanted to show this example with you because I think it shows that the indicators enable us to critically look at our own policy based on evidence and data, and not only by perception. So as Jesper has shown us, the first indicator has been published. It's accessible online, which I think is really helpful in starting this conversation with civil society as well. And I think it's important to mention that the indicators are not meant to rank countries, can be used to start an open discussion, to explore the differences, to explain maybe why there has been a certain focus within policy, to see where there are policy gaps, and to pave the way forward, basically. So for us, to share a personal experience, we noticed that even during the collection of data, by answering the survey, you are forced to critically look at your own policy and your own answers. And as the process of data collection and publication of the indicators is done in several steps following up on each other, this will also force our public administrations to continuously pay attention to the topic of anti-corruption and integrity. Which I find interesting is, or what I find interesting, I would say, is that the OECD always mentions that the indicators can be used to inspire actionable change. And I really like the part of inspire, because with the indicators, quite practically, we will be able to acknowledge our gaps, track our progress, get in touch with other countries. So really have this international collaboration for anti-corruption and integrity, and learn from each other. So to conclude, I'm looking forward to the publication of the other indicators, such as the upcoming on accountability. I know it's going to be quite some work, so many thanks to the colleagues from the OECD already for all the hard work that you're doing, especially with countries having trouble to deliver all the data. And I'm sure it will continue to inspire us and hopefully bring us all further in the tackling of corruption and fostering integrity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tessa. I will give you my job next time. I think you did it much better than I did, to be honest. Okay, we're going to go through, and then we see if we have some questions later. I have Liz next to give us a few wise words. Liz.
Great, thanks very much, Jesper. And really fascinating to see all of the work that went into this. It's always nice to look at the visuals, but actually it's a good reminder that there's a huge amount of work behind those nice visuals that we all get to play around with. So I wanted to just make a few points, and based on the perspective of a user, because at the Centre for the Study of Corruption at Sussex, we were recently asked by the UK government, what's the kind of best practice for developing an anti-corruption strategy? And they were thinking about this because the UK has a strategy at the moment, but it's coming to an end. So it's been a 5-year strategy, and this is the last year of the strategy. And so they're developing the new strategy at the moment. And as they do it, they're interested in thinking about how to do a really good job. And they're also interested particularly in thinking about how to evaluate their progress as they go forward. So one of the sort of sub-criteria within your national strategic framework section of the indicators. So a couple of reflections on that basis. I think the first is that it's not just, it is allowing you to see how you're doing, but by doing that, it's actually defining a benchmark and a standard. So all the work that you've done in terms of thinking about what those questions should be and what the criteria should be is then really useful for countries to be able to say, well, okay, this then is something that we can have a shortcut into thinking about what would be a really good way of doing this. What's the kind of expectation of the anti-corruption practitioners and the international standard setters out there in terms of what good looks like. So I think that's a very useful thing. And then, following on from that, of course, it does allow you to see how you're doing compared to other countries. Okay, we don't want a ranking, but sometimes it's useful to think, where are we compared to our peers? And I think one of the interesting things for us there in that work was that the UK was thinking about itself, comparing itself particularly to other G7 countries. And one of the really interesting findings, I think, from the indicators is that it's often not the G7 countries that are doing the best on this. So there's really great practice in Mexico. Argentina's coming out really well. Lithuania's coming out really well. So it's actually, I think, quite a nice wake-up call for those countries that see themselves as the rich, clean countries. That actually there's a lot of good practice coming from other countries. So that's a nice thing. But the other thing is that it enables you, when you're looking at that variation, you can see, well, why is it that Mexico is scoring so high on this? And then you can go off and explore with Mexico. So, what are you doing in this area? So I think it's nice also from that point of view. And then just to talk a little bit about that actionability part of it. Again, I think that's really nice in terms of seeing how to do better and in quite specific areas. So if you are interested in thinking about how to develop a monitoring and evaluation strategy to go alongside your anti-corruption strategy, so how are we going to check that we're actually achieving the impact that we want through this, not just outcomes, then this is helping to really dig down deep into what would we expect there and what could we be doing better. So a couple of things that come out in that strategic framework are things around the quality of the problem analysis. Clearly that's an important thing to do, but there's an awful lot of variation on how countries are doing it. How do we monitor and evaluate outcomes and impact? And again, a lot of variation there. So I'm going to stop there and pass over to Nishi.
Great, thanks a lot, Liz. I also will be very short because we lost quite a bit of time, so just offer a few general thoughts, hooking on to what Liz mentioned and a little bit the OECD presentation at the outset. So back to the context, kind of taking a little bit of a bird's eye view. So why are we talking about measurement? Why are there two sessions at this World Justice Forum on measurement, right? We have seen perceptions-based, expert assessment-based indicators for more than 20 years, closer to 30 now, I believe. But there is a distinct dissatisfaction with them. And I just wanted to show you one example why I think there is a lot of dissatisfaction. And let me share my slides. So one of the things which we want from governance and integrity indicators is that we can use them to guide policy action, understand how things work. Liz talked about policy evaluation. Tessa talked about the use of the indicators for individual governments to see where they are, where their strengths and weaknesses are. So this is, a basic expectation. And the problem with a lot of the existing perceptions and expert assessment-based indicators is that they don't really help us understand if we are improving or not. So here's an example. The COVID-19 pandemic, you might argue, is probably the biggest shock to corruption control in the last 10 years, right? It's a big thing, a lot of spending very quickly, and a lot of the times with relaxed control. So you would naturally imagine a considerable degree of corruption increase, right? We have seen numerous scandals from otherwise relatively well-governed countries like the UK, Germany or Sweden. So really, there is an argument that if we have good enough indicators and we have this big shock to corruption control, it should show up in our data. So I just brought up one country. There are a lot of others, and really it's just for illustrative purposes. So here is the CPI, the Corruption Perceptions Index of Romania. And it's scaled like higher values are better, lower values are lower. And what you see from 2020 to 2021 or 2019 to 2020, so really the period before and during the COVID-19 pandemic, is that Romania's score really remained stable. If anything, it improved a little bit. That's the +1 score. So my worry is that if you wanted to see if COVID-19 pandemic worsened or improved or impacted anyway Romania's anti-corruption framework, then this indicator is not telling you anything, and you really should expect it to tell you something. So let me show another look at this, and that is detailed public procurement data looking at red flags in public procurement. So the kind of things which are directly impacted by the pandemic. So you can look at direct awards or very short bidding periods, so that companies very quickly have to respond, non-competitive tenders, things like that, which are risk factors, even though not directly measures of corruption. And then you could see a much more detailed figure for Romania. That's quarterly data covering the last 6 to 7 years, in particular COVID products, healthcare market and non-healthcare market. And you could see that there's an immediate jump for COVID products after the pandemic. And this is what you expect, right? Because the rules have been loosened. There's suddenly a lot of spending, a lot less control, a lot fewer signatures needed because money just had to be spent on certain markets. So that's sort of expected, and it's reassuring that if you go deep into one sector, if you have behavioral indicators, they give you the sort of detailed view and large changes which are commensurate, like in line with what we would expect from a large shock like COVID-19. Okay, so let me stop this example. Hopefully I could demonstrate the value of what the OECD is achieving, Liz is working on, and Tessa is putting a lot of effort into. We want to see policy change. We want to see the impact of large changes to regulatory frameworks. Otherwise, our indicators are not helpful for policy purposes. They might be useful for other things, like perceptions are very important for understanding what voters think, for politicians, so on and so forth, but they're very far removed from actual behavior. So moving up to my second point and really just hammering this message further and underlining it even more. So if you want to do data which is useful for policy, you really have to go beyond this country level, very high level perceptions, and go into specific areas, strategic framework, legislation, so on and so forth. And once you start to go within countries and within looking at the particular sectors within a country, and interesting things emerge. And here again, I just give you a few examples to demonstrate this point. Again, just sharing some quick slides. So here is data from 4 countries looking at all their past bills for a short period: France, Hungary, Italy, and the UK. So UK should be the 4th one. And if you look at the number of days they spent in Parliament, recall Jesper talked about emergency procedures in Parliament, emergency lawmaking. Well, this is a hallmark of it, right? If lawmaking is very short, so bills spend very few days in Parliament, that is an issue. Now, what does this chart tell you, right? We have an enormous and very skewed distribution of bills, time spent in Parliament. Some spend years before they actually get passed. So a single country average might not be the most useful indicator you can get. So let's zoom in on 80 days, sort of the bulk of the laws passed. And here you can see, so between 0 days to 80 days spent in Parliament, you could see that there is a non-negligible part of these laws in these 4 countries where the number of days was very short, 1 week, 2 weeks. You can imagine busy parliamentary schedule, and then you have 1 week for a law, right? I mean, it probably is clear to argue that that's an integrity risk. And this data doesn't even include COVID-19. Now, if I look at by country and don't pull together for countries, you could see that this is a problem in different countries to different degrees. There's a lot more of such quick lawmaking in Hungary. You know, you're going to 3, 4, 5% of the laws, versus in France that is very much a minor and rare activity. So hope that these few charts demonstrated the point that going into countries, looking at particular sectors, looking at detailed data is really what can give you actionable insights, because then you can look at what was going on with these laws. Were they having a particular impact on certain sectors? Was there favoritism or any other governance failure in there? So just concluding, I think the sort of indicators the previous speakers talked about are really the typical, the dominant indicators. I hope will be in the next 5 to 10 years. And these indicators, especially the ones based on big data, I think the time really has come, because there's so much data online, so much data in electronic format, and we have the tools and the computational capacity to process them. So next to a sort of survey Jesper mentioned, we can put up what's going on in the administrative data of various governments, and you can build real-time monitoring tools, which not just give you a snapshot per year per country, but really allows you to look at problems in a real-time sense. Thank you.
That was really excellent. I like all the examples, actually. I think they really speak very well to the whole session. Indeed, so we have in the next set of indicators coming out, one of the 17 is the one on extraordinary procedures. There's also the one on laws amended within a year. So there's so much data there, as you say, Mihai, to mine, right? And the different methods are quite complementary. That's why I think we work quite well together. That in some cases, countries don't even know that this data is already public. And then we can say, actually, this is accessible on your parliamentary website. So, you know, things are changing. There's this push to publish data, but it hasn't been used yet to provide these actionable measures that even the anti-corruption authorities or those responsible for public integrity could easily use to inspire their approach. So and the next framework we're rolling out, the next set of indicators is on internal control and risk management. And I wish we had done it before COVID, you know, because these are some of these real safeguards for effective public spending, for reducing waste, and I think here we will, again, this is one of the areas, there are just no indicators on this. There are no indicators anywhere. There's a lot of procedural guidance, there's a lot of kind of peer review reports, but nothing specifically on what constitutes, as Liz said, if you, as a government official, what constitutes a good kind of building block for a good internal risk management system. So that we think will be very useful. We have a few minutes to take any questions from those listening in. Thank you for staying on. No obligation, but you know, you already tuned in the beginning, so we know your faces. Don't be scared to tune in again if you're still there. Otherwise, Liz will entertain us for a minute until people gather the courage to ask a question. Go ahead, Liz.
I just wanted to say actually another point that I think is really nice about the fact that you're engaging with governments to do this. You know, obviously what we want to achieve with indicators is that things improve. And so I was just thinking that there's probably an indirect impact just of the fact that actually to even gather the data, you're engaging so much with governments, and hence, you know, they're having to think have we got this data? Should we be collecting this? Should we be collating it? So just to wanted to sort of make the point around the kind of already the sort of indirect impact you might have in terms of building change and better practice.
Very much. I see Rebecca's hand is up.
Hi, thank you guys so much for this presentation. This is really interesting and I'm looking forward to seeing all the indicators published. I'm curious, and a few of you mentioned the ability of using this data to track change over time. And I'm curious kind of how you all envision the collection cycles taking place, what frequency, and then also how that might impact the way you're visualizing the data. Will we be able to compare across time, similar to how we can compare different countries? Thank you.
No, that's an excellent question. And it will, when you deal with kind of live data, things are quite messy. It's also a matter of resources. It's also a matter of the capacity of countries and how frequently they can actually provide us with this data. But the indicators are built with the purpose of being a time series. And we're kind of lending inspiration from other indicators that are built the same way. But it's a little bit premature to talk about it. But like I see there are some leading indicators where we would love to have annual data. So for example, implementation rate. These are published annually by countries. And these are some of the kind of leading indicators for the other ones that deal more with the more static ones around regulatory safeguards, for example. Regulatory safeguards, they don't update that often. They update whenever there is a new law being passed, and the whole kind of strategic framework is updated every 3-4 years. So really, we will have a very iterative approach to update whenever the most recent change has happened. We would want to update the framework. Well, we're very open about kind of building this ship at sea, but you are definitely right that this is an ambition that we have, and we'll make it even better to show that. And just to respond quickly to Liz's point before, I think, part of this is very true, that just focusing on what data is useful for countries promotes action as well. And we kind of had two approaches to doing this. So all of the indicators we would within the task force talk about, is this reasonable to expect that a government would have this data? Would it be useful for a government to have this data? And actually all the task force members agreed for all the indicators that this would be a useful thing to have, which gives us that mandate to say, okay, for some countries it's easy. You have a centralized approach. You have a central agency that always collates this data. For other countries it's decentralized, but still it would be very nice to at least kind of collate this data within the government and publish it. And then we have a few examples of, kind of where countries just said, well, it's very few countries that have this data, but it would be very useful for all countries to have it. So in the case of kind of complementing the implementation rate of supreme audit institutions, which is like a classic key performance indicator, the UK, Australia had a very nice indicator on taking the impact of the supreme audit institution in parliament. And there are two ways of doing this. So the intensive way is to survey MPs, which some sites do. The less intensive is to mine the parliamentary records for any positive mentions of the SAI, which is a proxy, so less resource intensive, but still those two countries found it a really good indicator, Australia and the UK, and we're trying to kind of promote that also as an indicator that the Netherlands, the SAI of the Netherlands could adopt, and many others. So yeah, it's much more than just showing. It's kind of spreading and viewing government as a data provider and not just a data consumer, because as Mihai said, we've had this tendency of looking at our area as the role of governments is to look at all these expert assessments that are coming in. And actually, they should do that, but they should also provide and be data producers in this area. Okay, any more questions? And before we close, Kirsty asked because she joined and she wanted to record the session, and I didn't do it from the beginning, but she asked me to just share these. So the recording has missed the initial presentation, but I will just for the benefit of the recording go back and do the whole presentation again. No, I will not. I will just put up this slide so you can see and you can find the names. I'll put on this slide, and then the most important is I'll put on this slide, so that anyone who views the recording can find back. And you can just honestly send us an email. We're quite easy to find. Send us an email. And we will share the PowerPoints with you. So thanks a lot, everyone. We overcame the technical difficulties, so we can feel proud of that today. And looking forward to seeing you again for another event